So thanks very much, Graham. That was great. Yes, really, this project, this paper came about from the experience of lockdown, and we've all been through it more or less. And and what happened during lockdown was really all our contact with other people sort of became focused on screens. And basically what we saw were people on screens in front of us. And I'm sure we've all had far too many Zoom meetings to ever want another one, but we will. And we had this new normal. And one of the things that became clear as we were sort of finding our way through lockdown and working out how we could use various forms of media and networked media to actually replace those human-to-human interactions is that as the number of people in a social situation increased, the actual experience of replacing that with a network solution became less comfortable, less satisfactory. And so on the one hand, I'm sure, particularly academic colleagues, you've had the experience of sitting in very big meetings, which could have worked. Oh, my computer's just trying to get rid of Flash Player. Sorry about that. Very big meetings where, which would have worked all right if they'd been in person, but actually on Zoom or Teams were really not satisfactory at all. Now, set against this, there was a continual stream of sort of cultural production, and here I'm talking about, items in the media, newspaper articles, blog articles, where people were clearly missing the social experience, the experience of sort of what I've called amiable crowds. In other words, spaces which not necessarily really crowded, but actually going into a space and having people around that space, people doing their own thing, but a shared sense of space with a lot of people in it. And people really talked in very melancholic terms about this, how they really missed, going to restaurants and bars, performances and galleries, or just crowded streets in the city. Now, of course, we're familiar with, VR and other sorts of things being used to sort of supplant solutions, and make up for lacks. And indeed, one could see the whole of AR as a way of actually overlaying the sort of, brackets real world with that more information because of some perceived lack in reality itself. And I suppose that the end point here really is that, during lockdown, Twitter, Instagram, all those, they became much more important. And looking at the sort of sum of human experiences and human interactions, we used to have meetings, we used to have protests, we used to have seminars, we used to have a whole lot of situations where we discussed things and came to an opinion about things in common, but all we were left with Twitter. So what this paper does is really present a piece called The Wisdom of Crowds, and it's a generative VR system, and it's supposed to be a starting point towards the simulation, the real-time simulation of crowds within VR. And it's part of a long-standing project I have, which is really looking at real-time social media data to expose various aspects of collective thought. And I've presented things on that in the past at EVA. This is a little bit different because this project is really looking at the emergence of sort of common understanding, that sense of actually being in a meeting where things are being discussed, or being, on a demonstration, or being in a seminar, where you're actually looking at people expressing different points of view, and together everyone is coming to a common understanding. Now, what I've done in terms of real-time data is I've used Twitter, and one of the reasons for that is it seems to me there's something about Twitter which really privileges polemics. It sort of seems to stimulate people to go into an argument mode, and I think we've all seen how that can become far too bitter and far too personal, and perhaps far too exposing as well. But one of the things about Twitter which is much less understood than it should be is that Twitter obviously has a public search API. You can search Twitter from a range of applications. But when you search for a tweet, you don't just get the text. You get a huge amount of information about the text, about its context, and crucially, about the author. And that includes, if they've supplied the information, what they look like, what their name is, where they live, what time zone they're in, what languages they speak, what their favorite colors are, all those sort of things. So from that, the idea is that actually you can populate a VR environment with visualizations of social media data. Now, before I go on to that, I really need to do a little bit of a digression into what crowds are. Because if you're going to look at, how digital media might satisfyingly repopulate the socially distanced world, first of all, one needs to ask, well, what are those features of that of the pre-socially distanced world that people are missing? And funnily enough, one of the things that became very clear is that what a crowd is surprisingly difficult to define. So yes, of course, a crowd is a lot of people altogether, but so is a military march, and so are people sitting watching a concert, and and all those sort of things. So in other words, it's not just about having a lot of people in one place. There's something about the people in that crowd, and there's something about the relationship between a number of features of the individual and the overall characteristics of the crowd. Now, I'm looking for a friendly crowd. I'm looking for a crowd that you might see if you walked around maybe a delightful street in Italy, or some parts of sort of more chic London, where there are cafe pavements and people are wandering about. Perhaps there's beautiful architecture and public art to look at. In other words, I'm not looking so much at a crowd where you might be going to a football match or going down into the tube. Those are obviously crowds, but there's very much a common purpose amongst those sort of people. So the first thing that people, that you look for in that crowded situation is what I've called heterogeneity. In other words, you expect a lot of different sorts of people in there: old people, young people, people on their own, people in small groups. If everyone looks the same, suddenly you're into a slightly dodgy sort of military parade territory, where everyone looks exactly the same and actually individuality is very much suppressed. For that sort of general benign feeling, it's very important that individuality is a feature of that crowd. And the second thing is that people need to be doing different things. If you think about all sorts of situations where you have a lot of people together, the more everyone is doing the same thing, the less like a happy crowd it is. So it might be a gymnastics display. It could be, again, a military. The military are very useful in thinking what a friendly crowd isn't, I have to say. Or it could be a whole lot of people panicking and running away from something. Again, everyone's doing the same thing. That's not a friendly crowd. Then in terms of what I've called the common narrative, often crowds do have a narrative. So it might be people just walking around a park. There is a very weak common narrative there, but actually individually, people won't have to follow it slavishly. They can sit down for a bit, they can look at the view, they can eat an ice cream, all those sort of things. So we've got this parameter space here where actually the axes are between similar and different. And for each of those three areas, the more they're similar, the less like a happy crowd, and the more like, display or a gymnastics display or a military march, that sort of thing. The more different they are, the more you're getting sort of happy crowds. And of course, different sorts of crowd situations can be placed in different areas of that axis. So in terms of, everyone doing the same thing, well, a concert audience, they're all doing pretty much the same thing. So on that axis, they're a bit towards similar. They may not be doing exactly the same thing. Some people may be sitting differently. So you can see that actually you can put different sorts of crowds on this 3D axis system and come up with a lot of characteristics that are important. There's more, however, about crowds, of course, and we really need here to talk about size. Size does matter when it comes to crowds. And there are two numbers, really. The first one is the absolute numbers. I would say, you can't have a crowd if there are only sort of 6 people. Even if you put them in a very small room, we wouldn't say that was a crowd. We'd say, a small group there, but we wouldn't describe it as a crowd. So on the one hand, absolute number is important. But perhaps more important is the density per square meter. And you can see there, I've got some images from Professor Still, for the key skill. And on the left, you've got 0.5 people per square meter, and it doubles each time. So you can see very quickly, some people would say that was a crowd, some say it wasn't a crowd. The middle one, I think people would say, oh yeah, that's looking more crowded. And by the time you get to 2 people per square meter on the right-hand side there, that's definitely a crowd. I think we can all agree with that. So, that's the density, the number of people per square meter is very important for that crowd identity. The other thing is that there are good studies looking at actually the experience, the individual experience of a crowd and how that relates to density. And generally you can draw quite a linear graph that actually, as density goes up, the pleasurability of it gets less, because people start getting close to you and and you're pushed together. That sort of personal space is not supported. So given that, let's talk about simulating crowds. And the first thing I should say is it's got a very long history in computer science. So, right from 1979, the key paper really is Thalman and Musa. And this diagram comes from them. And they looked at, simulating crowd behavior. Oh, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Basically, there are two main approaches. Firstly, you can actually look at overall behavior, and you simulate a crowd a little bit like you'd simulate a gas or a liquid going through different things. In other words, you have some algorithms which determine the sort of overall behavior. And for crowds, that's quite often validated against video recordings of actual crowds. That's very, very good if you're looking at architectural simulations. How will people behave in this building if there's a fire? How will people move in and out of buildings? All that sort of thing. It's much less good if you want a crowd, particularly that's being visualized in terms of a game or immersive media, where actually you need individual agents and you need individual interactions, and the visual appearance of those individuals may be very important in sort of making the overall scene plausible. Okay, so crowds and interacting in immersive media. And the first thing to say is this is a non-trivial problem when you start getting a lot of individual agents. And the more individual agents you have that you have to actually animate and model and provide behaviors for, computationally it becomes much, much more difficult. And so in the past, in games and other immersive media, we didn't really have big crowds. The idea was to try and use smaller rooms so that actually you could have some people, but you didn't have a lot of people. That has changed, and crowds have become both a backdrop for the action and also pleasing the crowd has become a game object. So we've got Hitman 2 here, which is 2018, and that has 2,000 non-playing characters. In other words, they're individually animated, but they're very much low level. And what they do is they have a very clever way that actually if you get close to a character, it can switch over to becoming a sort of fully AI character. So you can interact with all these 2,000 NPCs, but they don't have to actually all be fully AI driven all the time. Planet Coaster from a couple of years before, a little bit more stylized, you can see there, but an amazingly impressive 10,000 NPCs. And there you actually won the game by designing a theme park that the crowds liked. So one of the things about immersive experiences, you were looking at crowds, obviously they're difficult, you've got lots of animations, you've got lots of different permutations of people you've got to supply, and they're always a little bit cut off because, if for no other reason that the equipment used in VR, the goggles, putting them on, possibly tracking stations around if you've got that sort of system, and it may be tethered as well. That definitely acts as a barrier to sort of real life because there's this real hard transition of when you put the headset on, you're split off from it. And one of the things I was interested in was seeing if we could use social media real-time data to actually augment all the techniques people have come across for creating crowds, for simulating crowds, and actually provide a link back to that real life. So here we have some stills. So what I've done, I used the open source Twitter search API. And the idea was to embody social media tweets. In other words, you take a tweet and then you, using the metadata from that, you'd actually populate an individual in this crowd. As I said, tweets have very extensive metadata, and that was mined, and then that was then, images of people were downloaded, for example, and in future iterations, I'd use where they were to sort of inform other details of the character. So I generated individual agents from the metadata. I'm going to try now and do that very difficult thing, a live demo. It worked briefly when we tried it before the session started, so my fingers are going to be crossed here, people. This is the starting point. What you won't see is a massively different crowd in terms of the characters. I've just coloured them differently to show the way I could do there. But the point is here, these are people developed from real-time Twitter data, and let's have a look. So I'm now going to very quickly switch over if I may. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to start sharing, and there. Yep. Okay. Right, let's go. Okay, so it's starting up. It says it's ready for you. Oh, what? Yes, good. Okay, so when it starts up, I've set it up to first of all search for the word wisdom, you know, wisdom of crowds. Okay, if we just go over a bit, we should see. Ah, yes, here's our crowd. So it's pulling in Twitter data. Let's go and have a look and see what people are saying. Excellent. I make no comment, people. Obviously, the thing about Twitter, the dangerous thing about Twitter is you can't control what people say. And that's, you know, that's crowds for you. There's always a certain bit of thing. So another biblical one. There's an awful lot of the Bible on Twitter. Okay. Oh, there's some more over there. At the moment, it's far too spread out. You know, as I say, this is proof of concept. And what I didn't want to have to do is, seems like wisdom is very tied up with. Now, I don't know if you can see, but each of these people, I mean, they're different colors, but they've also got pictures. Yes, can you see? Oh, you can just see it there. They've each got a picture of the user in their face. And while we were all wearing masks, and I must say I mourn the eventual passing of masks on the 19th of July, while we were all wearing masks, the idea was actually to make this a sort of simulation of the socially distanced world within a socially non-distant virtual world. This is where I'd like to get all interactive, as you know, interactive media is our thing after all. Would someone like to suggest a word for me, please, to search for, to look at the wisdom of crowds? I need a word, and I can't see the chat at the moment, people. Sorry, because I'm full screen.
Lily suggests compassion.
I like it. Okay, let's see what the crowd think about compassion. Ah, okay. Okay. Okay, well, as I say, you can't control the crowd, and that's part of the thing we like about them. I think unless anyone's got a burning desire to consult the oracle or the wisdom of crowds on one more word, we could probably call it a day there.
I was thinking about wilderness. Here.
Wilderness, let's do that. Oh, yeah. Interesting. I'd quite like to see that.
Fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
I was thinking, Ian, because we live in such a cluttered world with so much going on that people sort of yearn for the wilderness sometimes. I just wonder.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, people like Sue Thomas have talked about technobiblio biophobia and things, haven't they? Yes. Yeah.
Ian, that's absolutely fantastic, and I'm so glad your live demo worked.
Yes, me too. Thank you very much for taking the risk, everybody.
Thank you.